Stanley Johnson, we're here to talk about the 1970s in Britain and how the environment was then and how the whole environment movement grew, because you saw it from a very, very early stage. And take us back to the late 1960s. What was the mood of the country then? Was there a feeling that we really had to grapple with this thing called the environment? Or was it still a very, very old-fashioned agenda looking back? What was actually going on in the late 60s?
Well, I can always remember people used to say about the 60s, if you can remember the 60s, you weren't there. Well, actually, the 60s, I was mainly working in America, but I did come back to this country, i.e. the UK, halfway through 1969, and I came back, just to answer your question, almost exactly at the same time as the first American landing on the moon happened. And this was actually a pretty crucial point from the evolution of the environmental movement. Why? Because suddenly we had those first photographs of, it was called Pale, Fragile Spaceship Earth, and wow, are we busy making a mess of it. Okay, 1969, Americans have landed on the moon. Rachel Carson has written her fantastic book, Silent Spring. We know what DDT has wrought in terms of ravages to wildlife. That was an absolutely seminal book. So there's a build-up. At the same time, 1969, we have the Tory Canyon. I'm not making a political point here. The Tory Canyon, if you remember, was a ship, a cargo ship, and it crashed somewhere on the reefs near the Scilly Isles. And Harold Wilson, who was then the Prime Minister, decided to get the RAF in to bomb. We still had an RAF, we still had bombers, and they bombed it. So what I mean is, late 1969 was a big build-up in environmental consciousness, and this spilled over into the early 70s. I came back from America. Brilliantly, I was given a job as the Conservative Party's first environmental research officer. So my job was to say, what do the Tories want to say as they come into the 1970 June election, which you will remember they won, and Heath said we're going to do the environment, and of course we're going to do Europe. So for me, that was the run-up. That was the run-up, and it led, of course, principally to the Stockholm Conference.
Okay, well, go back a little bit. What were the big issues at that time? I mean, you got involved fairly quickly with areas like population and the need for legislation. What were the issues which people were getting hold of at that point?
Well, I would say, if we're talking about the UK context, we had, of course, a certain degree of complacency, I've got to tell you, in the UK about our environmental record. We said we had the Alkali Act of 1861, we had clean air legislation, we had clean water legislation. We weren't really sure that we needed to take a huge push in Britain. Nevertheless, we saw that there was a groundswell of opinion going on, partly because this was also the run-up to Earth Day in the United States, partly because at that time we had some really important reports coming out. There was the Club of Rome report, which I think was about 1971. Teddy Goldsmith, uncle of Zach, brother of Jimmy. Teddy produced, with his associates like Robert Allen, this absolutely brilliant report called Blueprint for Survival, which the Ecologist, in one of its very early issues, printed in its entirety. And I've got to tell you, I regard the Club of Rome and Teddy Goldsmith and the Blueprint for Survival as really milestones in the evolution of environmental policy.
And in your own personal evolution as an environmentalist?
Yep, I'd say so, because those were documents which said, what is the hope for mankind? The hope for mankind is to stabilize and preferably reduce population, and above all, not to go hell for leather for economic growth. In other words, it really questioned the basic model on which societies have been trading for years. And I still think those were words well said. And if you look back at it now, you say that in both respects we have signally failed to achieve results.
If I remember, you became one of the most active voices for the world to take attention or pay attention to the population issue. And you wrote a book at the same time as Paul Ehrlich, which was basically saying, look, unless we get this under control, we've got enormous problems. What made you get onto this particular issue?
For me, it goes back to 1958, being in the common room at Exeter College, Oxford, when I was an undergraduate, joining me in 1958, maybe 1959, and reading the results of the Pugwash Conference and just reading about the sheer, as it were, geometric increase in the world population. I did say to myself, and I believe that for the next 20 years, that unless something is done about population, most other efforts will fail. And so, in fact, I went off and spent the first several years of my career working on population issues in Washington and in New York, and eventually we set up an organization called the UN Fund for Population Activities, which aimed, to help developing countries deal with their population issues. So yes, for me that was a very important issue, and I came into environment, as it were, on the back of that.
What then happened with the Conservative Party? Because I can't remember exactly who was in power at that point. Did Labour, did the rest of the government start paying attention to these issues? I mean, were we getting the first bits of legislation to really reduce pollution to...
Well, this is where, of course, we slightly come into the EU framework. I was lucky enough to be appointed in 1973 to the newly invented EU's environment programme. I say newly invented because the EU did not have an environment programme until the beginning of 1973, as a result of the Paris Heads of Government meeting in October 72. So I was lucky enough to be, Britain joined the EU, and I was lucky enough to be sent there to run the Prevention of Pollution programme. During the 70s, I think it would be fair to say, and during the 80s, and as it were forever after, most of the UK's environmental legislation has flown from these European agreements, which were brought out in response to the EU succession of EU environmental programs. And they were serious agreements, and they dealt with water pollution, with air pollution, with chemicals, with noise, and increasingly, as we came to the 80s, with nature protection and what you might call quality of life issues.
And you were right in the middle of the debate about habitats and how to protect areas. And what was going on there?
Well, this is moving actually into the 80s now, because I'd say that in the 70s, it was still pretty much focused on the pollution type issues and the chemical type issues, and of course the ozone issue as well came up a lot in at the end of the 70s. The habitat issue, which was for me very much kind of personal. I grew up in Somerset. I grew up on a farm, and so nature protection for me has always been an absolute priority. Yes, we had in the late 70s something called the EU Birds Directive, and when I came back from my stint as a member of the European Parliament, I came back to Brussels in 1984, I said to myself, it is ludicrous that we have an EU directive on the protection of birds, but not an EU directive on the protection of habitat more generally. And so we drafted, towards the end of the 80s, something called the EU Protection of Habitat and Species Directive. It took quite a long time to get that through the Council and through the Parliament, but it has now, as it were, emerged and evolved into an EU-wide network, which is called Natura 2000, which at this present time I think covers, roughly speaking, 17% of the land mass of the European Union in terms of protected areas. So if I were to look back on my life, and I didn't intend to start doing that for another few decades, but were I to look back on my life, I would say, until it gets dismantled by people like George Osborne, that directive is my life's best thing I've done.
Stanley Johnson, thank you very much indeed.